Hi guys. Media Visuals here.
Before we start, warning. Spoilers ahead. Today, I'm gonna explain an American drama, fantasy, and thriller movie called Life Changer. The movie starts by showing a woman waking up in a hotel room. Her name is Emily. It is very strange that there is a dry corpse beside her that looks similar to her. Knowing what to do, she chops the dead body into pieces and puts them into the garbage bags. Afterwards, she brings the garbage bags into someone's barn and burns them down. She also buries the ash into a hole. After a while, she goes to a cafe. Strangely, she practices to introduce herself and also learns about herself. After that, she returns to her home where her boyfriend has been waiting for her to come home recently. While she is smoking in the living room, her boyfriend, James, suddenly approaches her. He then asks where she has been going all this time. Thus, he called the police to find her whereabouts. When he wants to call the police, Emily immediately kills him. Without feeling guilty, she erases all the evidence of her murder just now. She also wraps James's body and hides it in the basement. After everything is finished, she takes antibiotics for her unknown disease. The next day, she is worried because her body begins to rot. She does not expect her body to rot so quickly. Later, the detective hired by her boyfriend comes to her house. His name is Ransom. He is initially surprised, seeing that Emily was already at home. He also wants to meet with James, but Emily replies that he was not with her. She then invites him to chat in the living room. When she sits beside Ransom, she suddenly holds his hand tightly. A few minutes later, Ransom's body becomes a dry corpse as Emily has turned into Ransom. To get rid of the evidence again, he breaks the dry corpse with a hammer. He also pours the gasoline around his house to set it on fire. At the front door, he meets with a delivery man who brings the food that was ordered by him earlier. The man also warns him that his house is on fire, but Ransom chooses to ignore him and immediately leaves the place with his police car. On his way, he realizes that he has to rely on antibiotics and cocaine to delay the rotting in his body. He then stops by a drug dealer and decides to buy some cocaine for himself later. A few hours later, it turns out that he wants to go to a bar to meet someone else. Arriving there, he is greeted by a dog as if they were old friends. He then enters the bar to find the person. After searching around, he finally finds the woman sitting alone at the bar. He immediately sits beside her and orders a gin, asking the woman if she wants one. At first, she is surprised that Ransom knows her only favorite drink at the bar. After introducing themselves, it is known that the woman's name is Julia. She asks how he knows her favorite drink, and he replies that maybe he guessed it by chance. At the end, they both spend all night talking and drinking together. But when they are kissing outside the bar, Ransom suddenly feels pain in his stomach. Because of that, he asks Julia to leave him alone, knowing that his body begins to rot. Fortunately, he manages to leave the place alone. Not far from there, he sees a couple talking inside a car. He then orders the woman to get out of the car using his police badge. He sits inside the car and tells the middle-aged man, named Sam, that he has to kill him or he will die later. Hearing this, Sam tries to fight back, but his efforts are in vain. Sometime later, it is known that Ransom has turned into Sam. He then destroys the dry corpse using a hammer before it is burned completely. Suddenly, his wife, Mary, calls him to come home. When he gets home, it can be seen that they don't seem to get along, indicating an unhappy relationship. The next morning, he is woken up by her daughter because he is late for work. It turns out that he still feels the pain in his stomach just like what he experienced before. He also refuses to join them for breakfast, lying to them that he has urgent work. Arriving at work, he talks with one of the receptionists there, named Rachel. She is also the woman who was in the car with him last night. Looks like they are having an affair. Then Sam continues his work as a dentist as usual. When having lunch at a restaurant, he sees Julia returning home alone. He quickly gets into a taxi and asks the driver to follow Julia's car, but sadly the driver does not want to because she thinks that stalking is not true. Therefore, he decides to go to the cinema and watches the film alone. That night, he has dinner with his family, but he looks unhappy at the same time. He seems to be thinking about his past before he changed from one body to another over the years. Furthermore, he visits the same bar where Julia is located. He knows that Julia always comes to that bar every night. Not long after, Julia sits next to him and says that she saw him the night before with a young woman. From that time, she admits that her marriage is not going well. She reveals that she was already married and had a son, but unfortunately her son died when he was 3 years old because of his severe illness, straining her relationship with her husband from that time. She also continues that one night, her husband prepared a romantic dinner for them. She thought that it was the perfect moment for them to make things up beforehand. But strangely, after the good time they had, her husband disappeared without a trace. Since then, she has never seen her husband until now. Meanwhile, Sam tries to comfort her by buying her another drink. After that, he goes to the toilet and sees that his body begins to rot. As a result, he says goodbye to Julia and decides to go to a motel for the night. Arriving there, he inhales the cocaine, realizing that his body is getting worse. In other words, he has to find another host to survive as soon as possible. With his brilliant idea, he calls Rachel to come to his place, saying that he is unwell. A few moments later, Rachel arrives at his place. She is confused when she sees Sam lying on the bed and does not react, even though she calls his name many times. She then slowly touches Sam's body. Just like before, now Sam has turned into Rachel's body. She immediately takes the antibiotics again. The following day, she burns the corpse in the exact same barn as Emily did earlier. But this time, she is almost caught by a woman around. She immediately leaves the place and heads to her workplace to get some antibiotics for herself, hoping that her body can last longer. That night, she returns to the same bar and directly approaches Julia again. This time, Julia recognizes her as the woman who was with Sam a few nights before. They both share their stories happily, until Julia gives Rachel her card so she can find and talk to her anytime. Shortly after, a man tries to flirt with Rachel, but she decides to ignore him as her eyes are still on Julia, who meets up with an artist man at another table. However, she accidentally sees her face on the TV as a suspected barn smuggler. She immediately asks the man to take her away from that place to his apartment. They are eventually having fun together, until the man gets high and turns aggressively at her. Because of that, she fights him back and ends up stabbing him to death. Outside, she quickly runs away from that place as the police arrive at the building. She manages to hide in an abandoned garage and spends the night in there. The next day, she finds out that her body begins to rot. She decides to spy on Julia and the man in the bar last night. When they both want to return to their respective homes, Rachel follows the man into his home. Feeling jealous, she intends to take the man's body. His name is Robert. After that, he calls Julia to confess his feelings all along and wants to see her again tonight. Soon, they have a romantic date at Julia's house. They end up falling in love with each other, eventually sleeping together at night, which is the only moment he is looking forward to the most. One morning, Julia sees the news on the TV about a serial murder that is still mysterious until now. Robert suddenly comes and changes the news immediately because he doesn't want her to watch depressing news like this. Unluckily, later he sees another blister on his hand and starts to feel the pain in his stomach. Desperately, he walks out from the bathroom and decides to confess everything to Julia. He tells her that actually he is Drew. At first, he does not know how to explain himself to her, even he doesn't know what he is. The only thing he knows is he unintentionally took over his mother's body, consequently killing her and got all the memories of her life in 1954. Every time he takes over someone's life, he also gets their memories. Since then, he only had two choices, kill or die. On the other hand, Julia thinks that the whole story was bullshit. To convince her even more, he reveals that Julia's husband who abandoned her in the past, was actually himself. Even though he turns into someone else continuously, he says that he will always love her forever. Because Julia is freaked out about all of this, she grabs a taser and attacks him until he falls off to the floor. Therefore, he holds Julia's hands to stop her, but then he accidentally takes her body. At the end, Drew, who is now turned into Julia, weeps over her dead body, regretting what he has done just now. A few days later, Drew desperately accepts his fate and bids his time to die. Strangely enough, he is instead reborn in the form of a gray-haired old man and then continues his life freely. Subscribe to watch more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.